The horses died first. They collapsed in the snow like broken puppets, their legs folding beneath them, steam rising from their nostrils until it stopped rising altogether. Soviet workers cut the harnesses and left the bodies where they fell because there was no time to bury anything in frozen ground. On the ice-locked coast of the Kola Peninsula, 12 miles from Murmansk Harbor, 3 Allied cargo ships sat stranded like beached whales, their hulls wedged against pressure ridges that no vessel could penetrate. Inside those holds lay 200 tons of tank ammunition, aircraft parts, and medical supplies. Enough to break the German siege at Leningrad, enough to save 10,000 Soviet soldiers who would otherwise die waiting for bullets that never came. But a British naval officer stood on the frozen shoreline and wrote in his logbook that the cargo was unsalvageable. He noted the date, January 14th, 1942. He noted the temperature, minus 38 degrees. He noted that convoy PQ-14 had already lost 12 ships to German bombers and U-boats before these 3 ran aground. Then he closed the book and walked back toward the harbor, because some losses were simply too large to fight. Tommy Flett watched the officer leave. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that officers who made decisions from warm rooms rarely understood what was possible in the cold. Tommy was 34 years old, Metis, born in the PA, Manitoba, where winter began in October and ended in May if you were lucky. He had driven dog sleds across frozen lakes before he could read. He had trapped beaver and marten in temperatures that killed men who did not respect the land. He had learned Russian from Orthodox missionaries who visited his village, and he had learned English from priests who tried to make him forget his mother's Cree. Now he stood on the edge of the Soviet Arctic, wearing a Canadian Army uniform he had never expected to wear, commanding 7 machines that no one here had ever seen. The Bombardier B-12 snow vehicles sat in a row on the ice behind him. They looked absurd, half-track, half-sled, painted factory yellow that had faded to a sickly cream. Each one carried a driver and 2 passengers. Each one had been designed for mail delivery in rural Quebec, not Arctic warfare. But Tommy had driven these machines through blizzards that would freeze a truck engine solid, and he knew something that the British officer did not. The cold was not the enemy. The cold was a language, and if you spoke it correctly, it would let you pass. Lieutenant Yevgenia Morozova approached him with a map in her gloved hands. She was 28, Soviet Army, former professor of literature at Leningrad University. 18 months of siege had stripped the softness from her face and replaced it with something harder, something that looked through people rather than at them. She unfolded the map and pointed at the stranded ships. 15 miles, she said. The cargo must reach the railhead within 48 hours or Leningrad falls. Her voice was flat, as if she were reading casualty figures rather than issuing a death sentence. Tommy studied the map. Pressure ice along the coast. Open leads that could swallow a vehicle whole. German aircraft patrolling from Petsamo. Soviet scouts reported ski patrols in the area. Mountain troops who knew how to fight in the snow. He folded the map and handed it back. 48 hours, he repeated. She nodded. Private Henri Coty approached, his face raw from the wind. He was 22, from Shawinigan, Quebec. Before the war, he had worked in the Bombardier factory, assembling the very machines he now maintained. He still believed in them the way a child believes in guardian angels. He told Tommy that all 7 B-12s were operational, fuel tanks full, engines warming. He did not mention that he had never seen combat. He did not need to. Tommy could see it in the way his hands trembled when they were not holding tools. The convoy departed at dusk. 7 vehicles, 14 men, 1 Soviet officer who did not believe they would succeed. The ice groaned beneath their skis. The wind carried the distant thump of German bombs falling on Murmansk Harbor. Ahead, the frozen coast stretched into darkness, white and endless and utterly without mercy. 2 miles out, the lead vehicle broke through thin ice. The driver scrambled free before the machine sank, but the B-12 was gone, swallowed by black water that sealed over within minutes. Tommy ordered the convoy to halt. He walked ahead alone, testing the ice with a long pole the way his grandfather had taught him. Behind him, the men waited in silence, watching their breath freeze in the air, understanding for the first time that the machines they trusted could betray them. Tommy returned and ordered modifications. Wider skis, redistributive cargo, escape hatches cut into the roofs. They lost 6 hours. 6 hours they did not have. But when they moved again, they moved together, and the ice held beneath them like a promise made by a god who had not yet decided whether to keep it. The blizzard arrived like a living thing, howling across the frozen coast with a fury that turned the air into a wall of white. Inside the remaining B-12 vehicles, men pressed against each other for warmth, engines running to keep the cold at bay, fuel gauges dropping with each passing hour. Tommy Flett sat in the lead vehicle and listened to the wind tear at the canvas roof. 40 hours into the mission, 8 miles covered, 7 miles still to go, and now this, a storm that could bury them alive before dawn. Corporal James Whitehorse sat beside him, eyes closed, head tilted as if listening to music no one else could hear. He was Cree, from Cross Lake, Manitoba, Tommy's oldest friend. They had trapped together as boys, hunted together as men, enlisted together when the war came looking for soldiers who understood the North. Whitehorse did not read maps. He read the land itself. The sound of ice cracking, the smell of pressure changes, the way snow drifted against ridges. The Soviets thought he was a shaman. He found this amusing, but never corrected them. Lieutenant Morozova's voice crackled through the radio. She demanded to know why they had stopped. Tommy told her the truth. Moving in this storm would kill them all. She responded that stopping would kill the soldiers waiting for the ammunition. Neither of them was wrong. That was the mathematics of war. Equations where every answer cost lives. The storm did not relent. Hours passed. Henri Coty worked on the engines, hands numb despite thick gloves, fingers cracking and bleeding from the cold. He had stopped believing the B-12s were indestructible. He had watched one sink through the ice and another throw a track that took 4 hours to repair. These machines were not miracles. They were steel and rubber and oil, and they could fail just like everything else at the T the 36th hour. The Germans found them .6 figures emerge from the white curtain. Ski troops in white camouflage, rifles raised, moving with the fluid confidence of men who owned this terrain. Tommy saw them first. He shouted a warning and reached for his weapon, but the Germans were already firing. Bullets punched through canvas. Glass shattered. A Canadian soldier named Beaulieu took a round in the chest and fell without a sound. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of chaos in a blizzard. Muzzle flashes like lightning. Screams swallowed by the wind. Henri killed a man. He did not see the face, only the silhouette, only the rifle swinging toward Tommy. He pulled the trigger and watched the silhouette crumple. Afterward, he crawled behind the B-12 and vomited into the snow. His hand would not stop shaking. Tommy told him that was normal. Tommy did not tell him it never stopped being normal. They won. 4 Germans dead. 2 escaped into the storm. 1 B-12 damaged by grenades, tracks torn, engine coughing black smoke. They buried Beaulieu in a snowdrift because the ground was too frozen for graves. Morozova said a prayer in Russian. Henri did not understand the words, but understood the tone. Exhaustion and grief worn so thin they had become almost mechanical. Night fell. The storm continued. Tommy ordered the men to rest while Whitehorse sat in the lead vehicle, listening. He had been listening for hours, his face calm, his breathing slow. Tommy asked what he heard. Whitehorse said the ice was singing. He said the wind was changing. He said if they waited 6 hours, the storm would break and they would live. If they moved now, they would die. Morozova called it superstition. Tommy called it survival. He ordered the convoy to hold position. 6 hours. 6 hours of waiting in the frozen dark while ammunition burned in Leningrad and soldiers died for want of bullets. It was the hardest order he had ever given. 6 hours later, Whitehorse was proven right. The storm died as suddenly as it had been born. The clouds tore apart and revealed a sky full of stars, cold and sharp as broken glass. The convoy moved. They covered 4 miles in 3 hours, more ground than they had gained in the previous 2 days. The ice was smooth here, glassy and solid, and the B-12s glided across it like boats on still water at T-dawn. They reached a ridge overlooking the stranded cargo ships. The vessels were still there, still intact, Soviet sailors waving desperately from the decks. But between the ridge and the ships lay a field of pressure ice, broken, jagged, walls of frozen chaos 10 feet high. No vehicle could cross it. Nothing could cross it. And on the horizon, growing louder with each passing second, came the drone of German aircraft returning with the morning sun. The pressure ice stretched before them like the spine of some frozen monster, ridges and crevasses interlocking in a maze that had stopped every Soviet attempt to reach the stranded ships. Tanks had tried. Horses had tried. Men on foot had tried, and some had never returned. Now Tommy Flett stood at the edge of this impossible barrier and understood why the British officer had written off the cargo. Some obstacles were not meant to be crossed. Some missions were meant to fail. Morozova appeared beside him. She did not speak immediately. She studied the pressure ice with eyes that had seen worse. The siege lines around Leningrad, the frozen corpses stacked like cordwood because there was no fuel to burn them. She pointed at the cargo ships 2 miles away. Then she pointed at herself. She would cross alone, on foot, to coordinate the unloading from the other side. Tommy told her it was suicide. She asked what her life was worth compared to the 10,000 soldiers waiting for those supplies. He had no answer. She began walking before he could find one that they rigged a cable system. A harpoon gun firing a steel line across the pressure ice. The line anchored to the lead B-12, Morozova tied to the cable with a harness improvised from cargo straps. She walked into the maze of broken ice and disappeared. The cable paid out behind her, jerking and stopping as she climbed over ridges, fell into gaps, dragged herself forward on hands and knees. Twice the cable went slack. Twice Tommy's heart stopped. Twice it jerked tight again, and he breathed. It took her 90 minutes to cross 2 miles. Soviet sailors pulled her aboard the cargo ship more dead than alive, her hands frozen to the rope, her face white with frostbite. But she lived, and through the radio, her voice came crackling with instructions. Send the cargo sleds. Tommy's plan was insane. He knew it. His grandfather had used something similar on the frozen rivers of Manitoba, anchoring sleds to trees, using rope and pulley systems to winch heavy loads across ice too thin to walk on. But this was not a river. This was Arctic chaos, and the loads were not beaver pelts but crates of tank ammunition that weighed more than the men pulling them. They worked in teams. One B-12 anchored on the ridge, engine running, winch engaged. A cargo sled attached to the cable, loaded with crates. Men on the other side, pulling, guiding, fighting the ice that wanted to swallow everything. The first sled made it across in 40 minutes. The second took an hour. The third sled snagged on a pressure ridge and hung there, swinging over a crevasse, until Henri crawled out onto the ice and freed it with a pry bar while the cable groaned beneath his weight. Then Whitehorse found the lead. A lead was a channel of open water in the ice, a wound that had not yet frozen. This one wound through the pressure ice like a black river, narrow but navigable, already skinning over with new ice. In 6 hours, it would be solid enough to walk on. In 12 hours, it would be thick enough to drive on. But they did not have 12 hours. The German aircraft would return at dawn, and this time, there would be no storm to drive them away. Tommy made the calculation. Empty vehicles could cross the lead now, while the ice was still thin. They could shuttle cargo from the ships to the far side, load it directly into the B-12s, and return before the ice sealed. It would burn every drop of fuel they had. There would be no return to Murmansk. They would be stranded on the Soviet shore, waiting for rescue that might never come, that he gave the order without hesitation. Henri protested. What about survival? What about getting home? Tommy asked him which mattered more, 11 men or 10,000. Henri did not answer. He started the engine and drove into the black water. The crossing was nightmare work. Thin ice cracking beneath the skis. Water seeping through the floorboards. The smell of diesel and salt and fear. Tommy drove the lead vehicle and felt the ice flex beneath him like a living membrane, felt it threatened to give way with every meter. Behind him, 3 more B-12s followed in single file, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their engines screaming with the effort. They made it. All 4 vehicles reached the stranded ships just as the eastern sky began to lighten. Soviet sailors swarmed the vessels, passing crates hand to hand, loading the B-12s until their suspensions groaned. 23 tons of supplies, tank ammunition, aircraft parts, medical equipment, enough to change the course of a battle. Dawn broke over the pressure ice. The B-12s sat on the Soviet shore, engines dead, fuel tanks empty. 11 men huddled against the cold, watching the lead freeze solid behind them. They had completed the mission. They were stranded. And from the west came the drone of Junkers bombers, growing louder with each passing heartbeat. 6 Junkers Ju-88 bombers came out of the western sky in perfect formation, their engines droning a death song that every soldier on the ice recognized. Tommy Flett watched them approach and felt something he had not expected: peace. The mission was complete. 23 tons of supplies sat on the Soviet shore, ready for transport to the railhead, ready for the journey to Leningrad, where starving soldiers would load those shells into Soviet tanks and push the German lines back one more bloody mile. Whatever happened next, they had done what the British said was impossible. They had done what everyone expected to fail. The first bombs fell wide, crashing into the pressure ice 100 meters from their position. Geysers of frozen water erupted into the air. The concussion knocked men off their feet. Henri scrambled for the machine gun they had salvaged from one of the B-12s, a weapon meant for ground defense, but the only thing they had. He mounted it on a cargo crate and aimed at the sky, knowing it was useless, knowing he would fire anyway. Morozova had reached them from the cargo ships, half frozen and limping but alive. She carried a radio pack on her back and a message from Mormont's command. Rescue forces were en route. For hours. She said it like a prayer. Tommy heard it like a threat. For hours was an eternity when bombs were falling. The bombers made another pass. This time the explosions were closer. Crates of ammunition detonated, sending shrapnel whistling through the air. A Canadian soldier named Tremblay took a piece of metal through his arm and screamed until Henri tied a tourniquet so tight it stopped the sound. White Horse dragged wounded men behind a natural ice bunker he had identified during the night, a ridge formation that deflected blast waves and provided cover from strafing runs. Traditional knowledge saving lives again. Henri fired the machine gun. The sound was deafening, the barrel jerking with each burst, spent casings bouncing across the ice. He could not hit the bombers. They flew too high, too fast, but he could make them cautious. One Junkers pulled away with smoke trailing from its engine, struck by a lucky round or damaged by the cold, or simply deciding that the risk was not worth the reward. The remaining 5 circled like vultures, waiting for clearer light. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun rose higher. The bombers made sporadic passes, dropping ordnance, strafing with machine guns, but they were wary now. Soviet fighters had been spotted over Murmansk, and the German pilots knew that lingering too long meant interception. They needed to finish this quickly or abandon the mission. Tommy found himself beside Morozova during a lull in the attack. She offered him Soviet tobacco and a flask of vodka. He took both. She asked about the brother he had mentioned, the one who would have been proud. Tommy told her about Pierre, 2 years younger, killed at Dieppe when the officers sent men up a beach that should never have been attacked. He told her about the telegram, about his mother's face, about the promise he made to lead differently. Morozova listened without speaking. When he finished, she said her husband had been a professor too. Literature, Pushkin and Tolstoy, shot in the first week of the invasion because intellectuals were enemies of the Reich. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. The tanks appeared on the eastern horizon. White Horse saw them first. Dark shapes moving across the frozen lead, engines roaring, treads churning through ice that had finally frozen thick enough to support them. T-34s, Soviet tanks, the same models the Canadians had delivered on a convoy 3 months earlier. The crews were young conscripts who spoke no English, no French, but they waved and shouted as they approached, and their meaning was clear. Rescue had arrived. The bombers saw the tanks too. They banked away, turning west, their mission abandoned. There were no weapons in the junkers that could touch a T-34, and the pilots knew it. Within minutes, the drone of their engines faded into silence, replaced by the grinding roar of Soviet armor. The evacuation was swift. Soldiers loaded onto tank hulls, wounded strapped to improvised stretchers, the cargo sleds hooked to towing cables. Henry's shoulder had started bleeding again, but he refused medical attention until the last crate was secured. Tommy watched the broken B-12S get pulled onto transport sledges, their yellow paint barely visible beneath layers of ice and grime. 7 machines had started this mission. 4 remained. 7 would have been impossible anyway. That evening, in Murmansk Harbor, a Soviet general pinned medals on the Canadian chests. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. There was a war to fight, no time for celebration. Tommy stood at attention and felt the weight of the medal against his uniform. He would never wear it again. None of them would. Morozova found him afterward, standing on the dock, watching supply trucks roll toward the railway station. She thanked him in Russian. He replied in his broken Russian that his brother would have been proud. She nodded. She understood loss. She understood what it cost to carry the dead forward. Years later, when Tommy Flett's grandchildren asked about the war, he would not speak of battles or medals. He would speak of 7 yellow machines and 12 men who crossed 15 miles of frozen hell, because someone had to, because the arithmetic of war demanded it, because somewhere in Leningrad, soldiers they would never meet were waiting for bullets that finally came.